With our mold complete, we're ready to set ourselves up for casting. Although we won't be working through the casting process in this course, we do need to understand how to position our mold for a successful casting. To do this, we'll use what's called a support cradle. Let's define what a support cradle is and look at some common materials they're made of. A support cradle is a permanent or temporary structure built to hold our silicone mold in a specific orientation throughout the casting process to ensure our mold performs as expected. Depending on our mold design, we may need our mold to be positioned at an angle in some direction so that an undercut properly fills, or to fill our mold without any use of vents. Beyond holding our mold in a certain orientation, support cradles also provide the necessary tension to hold multi-part molds together or to keep cut molds properly aligned. Like mold boxes, a support cradle can be constructed from whatever material we may have on hand using the tools that we are comfortable working with. The only things we'll want to keep in mind is the weight of our mold and casting material and the amount of tension required to keep our mold properly aligned. If we don't build a strong enough cradle, then it may break under the weight during casting. If we don't use enough tension, our mold may slightly move on us. If we apply too much tension, then we may slightly deform our mold, changing the shape of our casting. Not every mold we make will require a support cradle. Many one-part or block molds have a flat base that will easily keep our mold stable. However, as we continue in our mold-making journey and begin to create more complex molds, creating a support cradle will become a necessary step. Determining when we need a support cradle will depend on a few specific factors. Let's look at the two factors that determine whether we need a support cradle, and then review some of the common materials that we can use to fabricate the cradle that we need. The first factor to consider is what position our mold will be in order to fill properly. Looking at our mold design, we can see if there are any trouble areas, including undercuts, that may fill more easily if our mold is positioned in a certain way. If we planned around this using sprues and vents, then we most likely don't need any additional support. However, if we aren't confident that a certain area will fill without some help, then it's best that we design a way to ensure it does. The second factor we need to consider is the amount of tension required for our mold to hold its shape. If we've cut our mold, then the areas where our silicone is in two parts will need the proper amount of tension applied to hold its shape. This will always be the case when we're working with a multi-part mold that will need to be locked together during casting. To build a support cradle for positioning, it's common to use scrap wood and fasteners to loosely construct a solution. Alternatively, foam core can serve as an effective solution. Our cradle doesn't have to be pretty, we only need it to keep our mold in place while we pour. Depending on how our mold needs to be positioned, this may be as simple as using a few wedges to slightly tilt our mold, or as complex as building a whole new structure entirely. What we need to do will depend on our mold and the required position. With our mold in the proper position, we now need to make sure it's under the correct amount of tension. To dial in that tension, we have a few options. The simplest approach is to use rubber bands on the outside of our mold. Rubber bands will provide the tension required and can be slowly added one by one to increase that tension to the required amount. In some cases, our rubber bands alone may not be effective. The shape of our mold or the size may require that a rigid support on the outside also be used. It's common for multi-part molds to need this extra support. We can also take this opportunity to give our support board a rounded profile so that our rubber bands apply a more even pressure around our mold. If rubber bands are not strong enough, a couple of quick clamps in combination with a rigid support, like a piece of wood or another stiff material, can apply an even pressure, giving you the tension that you need. If all of these options won't work, then we can reassemble our mold box around our mold to achieve the same result. However, this only works if our mold box material is one that is durable enough to reuse. With our mold in its proper position and under the correct amount of tension, we need to situate our mold so that pouring our casting material is easy. Let's review some things to consider when positioning our mold for successful castings. Before we begin casting in our mold, we want to make sure that our mold is in a location where pouring will be easy to do. This is the same consideration we had to make when we positioned our mold box so that pouring our silicone was easy. Just like with our silicone, our casting material will need to be poured at the appropriate speed. If the amount we're pouring is large, or if we need to pour slowly, then placing our mold in a location that is comfortable to us is important. This may be on our work surface or even down on the ground where pouring a heavy material will be much easier. It's also important that we can easily see where we will be pouring our material. The opening or sprue that we need to pour our casting material into may be significantly smaller than we're used to. If our view is obstructed, then our chances of spilling material greatly increases. Our last consideration is making sure that our location and space is properly protected from potential spills. This may mean laying down plastic to protect our surfaces and make cleanup much easier. Our final consideration to make before we cast in our mold involves the use of pressure casting. When we previously discussed pressure casting, we learned that our pressure pot is a certain shape and size. If we plan to pressure cast and our mold and support cradle do not fit in our pressure pot, then we'll need to adjust our design. We can start by test fitting our mold and support cradle into our pot. If it's too large, then we can mark the spots where it's oversized to see if removing that section of our support cradle will compromise its design. If not, then we can simply adjust our cradle, test fit, and then move on. In some instances, we may need to design a completely new cradle in a new shape in order to fit it in our pressure pot. This is another example where using our mold box may be a more convenient solution, especially if we've already used that mold box in our pressure pot during our silicone curing. Remember, testing the fit of our mold support cradle before we begin our casting process is a key step to ensure our casting process proceeds as planned. Now that we've made a successful mold, let's talk about what we can expect from our mold throughout its lifetime. Let's review the expected lifespan when used or stored and the ways that we can extend that time. The type of silicone our mold is made out of will significantly impact what we can expect. We previously discussed a term called library life that described how long a mold that is complete, in storage, and not in use is expected to last. The library life of a tin cure silicone is anywhere from 1 to 10 years, while a platinum cure silicone's library life may extend closer to 30 years. However, this does not take into account the fact that we will be using our mold. When we use our mold for a casting, we often refer to that as a shot. One shot is one casting completed in our mold. For silicone rubber, we can expect to get anywhere from 30 to 50 shots out of a mold, depending on the type of casting material we use. Every time we cast in our mold, we are utilizing and depleting some of the key ingredients that give our silicone its excellent release properties. Some more aggressive casting materials deplete our mold faster, shortening our expected lifetime, while others are more gentle and may keep our mold working well beyond our expectations. In order to ensure we reach the maximum number of castings from our mold, we can do a couple of things. First, consistently using a mold release that is made to work with silicone and our specific casting material will provide a barrier that reduces the amount of depletion our mold experiences. A mold release also makes our demolding process much easier, limiting the physical strain placed on our mold. If we choose to use a mold release, it's important that we read our manufacturer's instructions so that we use the product as intended for the correct materials. Our second option for extending the life of our mold is using silicone oil. Silicone oil rejuvenates our mold and replenishes some of the key ingredients that have depleted after many castings. To add silicone oil to our molds, we'll simply apply some to a paper towel and spread it on the inside of our mold. We can also preheat our mold before applying our silicone oil to allow it to more deeply impact our mold. To get a maximum life out of our mold, we can use mold release for every casting and reapply silicone oil every 10 castings. When we're using our mold, we can expect that it will need cleaning between some castings. Depending on the casting material we use, this could be after every shot or after every few. Regardless, let's look at a few options for cleaning our molds and the pros and cons of each. Our first option is to use warm, soapy water. Since our silicone does not chemically bond to most casting materials, a gentle cleaning option like soap and water will do the majority of the job. A mild dish soap will work perfectly here. If we want a scrubbing utensil to aid in our process, then a soft bristle brush can be used to remove any dirt on the surface. Although soap and water is effective in cleaning, we will need to be aware that moisture can have a significantly negative impact on some casting materials, including polyurethanes. If we're using a casting material that is sensitive to water, then we'll want to make sure that our mold is thoroughly dry before doing so, or use an alternative option. A second option is to use acetone. Acetone is a chemical product that can easily break down and dissolve other substances. We can find this at our local home improvement stores, and it's fairly cost-effective. To clean our mold, we'll simply apply some acetone to a paper towel or rag and wipe away any residue that may be inside of our mold. It is important to note that acetone is a chemical and needs to be treated with respect. Acetone is extremely flammable and may not be the best option unless you are comfortable using the material safely. It's important to read the recommended uses and always follow the manufacturer's guidelines for safety. Our final option for cleaning out our mold is to do another casting. If we're using a casting resin such as a fast-curing urethane, we can add a small amount of properly mixed material into our mold and rotate our mold to spread it around. Once our casting has hardened, we can remove it and see the debris it's grabbed and remove it from our mold. Although this is a great option for a quick result, we are technically casting in our mold, and that means we are using another one of our shots. This is not a deal breaker for this method, but instead is something we need to note so that we can track how much longer we can expect our mold to last. When we aren't using our molds, it's important that we properly store them to keep them protected. Let's review the 3 rules for storing our molds and discuss why each one is so important. Our first rule for storing our molds is to keep them in a cool, dry place. Consistently high temperatures will slowly wear down our silicone molds. Warm environments that are consistently experiencing temperatures over 90 degrees will deplete some key ingredients in our material. Likewise, moisture in the air over time can react with some of the chemicals in our material and deplete its release properties. Plastic containers with a snap-fit lid are a great option to keep our molds visible yet protected from moisture. For smaller molds, a Ziploc bag will also limit moisture's ability to affect our molds. We'll just need to make sure those containers are still in a relatively stable climate environment that does not experience high temperatures. Our second rule for storing molds is to make sure they are stored away from any harmful UV rays, including rays from the sun. UV rays naturally degrade many materials over time since they break the chemical bonds. We see this all around us, and we often call it sun fading. Our silicone molds are not exempt from the destruction of UV rays. When storing our molds, we'll want to make sure they are away from any windows and not stored in direct sunlight. Our third and final rule for properly storing our molds is to do so in their natural supported position. If our molds are bent or out of shape when stored, we are putting added stress on our molds that may lead to a more permanent deformation. To avoid this, we can simply place our molds in storage in their natural casting position, whether it's on their flat base or secured inside their support cradle. Keeping our molds in their natural position will ensure they perform as expected. If you want to stay in the know, then sign up for our email, text, and follow us on social, where you can see the latest and greatest projects, courses, and other beautiful things that people just like you are making every day. Thank you again for joining us on this course, and we'll see you in the next one.